Welcome to Under Baobab Skies. We travel to a place where history isn't just written in books, but etched into the very sand and soul of the city, Timbuktu. There was once a boy named Bakari, which means one who will succeed. But in those days, success wasn't measured in gold or goods traded across the vast Sahara. It was measured by how well you could listen to a story and how long you could hold it in your heart. Bakari lived in the shadow of the great Sanka Mosque, where the call to prayer was a constant melody, mingling with the soft rustle of parchment and the whispers of scholars. His days began before the sun, as he swept the steps of a scholar's house. This scholar was an old man, his eyes deep and dark like ink wells, holding the wisdom of generations. He didn't pay Bakari with coins, which would be spent and forgotten. He paid him with lessons. Every grain of sand, the scholar would often whisper. His voice, like the dry desert wind, is a letter waiting to be read. You just need to learn the language. As the first light of dawn painted the mud brick rooftops in shades of soft orange and pink, and smoke curled up from small cooking fires, Bakari's world was one of quiet service. But he was no ordinary servant boy. He carried a dream as vast as the desert sky. He dreamed of becoming a keeper of knowledge, one of the revered guardians of Timbuktu's precious manuscripts. These weren't just books. They were scrolls and bound volumes that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries of African astronomy, law, poetry, and medicine. They were the memory of a continent. But the winds of change were blowing across the desert, and they carried the scent of danger. The caravans, once the lifeblood of the city, grew fewer and farther between. Rumors spoke of raiders who rode under the cover of dust storms, their motives as shifting and unpredictable as the dunes themselves. The libraries of Timbuktu, these magnificent, fragile treasure houses of paper and ink, were suddenly vulnerable. The knowledge they held was at risk of being scattered to the winds, or worse, consumed by fire. One night, the city's usual calm was broken. The scholar woke Bakari with a quiet but urgent hand on his shoulder. There was no time for questions. By the dim light of a single oil lamp, they began their sacred task. They packed the priceless manuscripts into sturdy leather satchels, their movements quick and practiced. As they worked, they whispered verses of protection over the books, prayers learned from their ancestors to shield them from harm. The boy's hands trembled as he held one of the scrolls. The script, a river of black ink flowing across the pale, aged pages, was a language he couldn't yet read, but he could feel its power. The parchment felt warm, almost alive in his hands, humming with the voices of poets, scientists, and philosophers who had lived long ago. The scholar paused, placing a hand on Bakari's. His gaze was intense. "Bakari," he said, his voice low and serious, "if these pages are lost, our voices will vanish with them. Our history, our songs, our discoveries, all of it will turn to dust." In the narrow, winding alleys of Timbuktu, torches flickered against the mud brick walls, casting long, dancing shadows. The boy, small for his age but determined, carried satchels heavy with the weight of his people's legacy. He followed the old man through the sleeping city, their footsteps muffled by the sandy ground. Just before the first hint of dawn, they slipped out of the city gates, two small shadows against the immense, dark expanse of the Sahara. They set out, guided by the familiar constellations and an unshakable faith. For 3 long days, they walked. The desert was a silent, watchful presence. The sun beat down, and the horizon shimmered with heat. The manuscripts, pressed close to Bakari's chest, felt like a second heartbeat, a rhythmic reminder of his vital mission. At times, Bakari felt the desert itself was testing him. It whispered temptations on the hot wind. Bury the books. find shade and rest. Forget this impossible task. The weight was immense, both physically and spiritually. But he remembered the scholar's words, felt the warmth of the pages against his skin, and he kept walking. On the fourth night, the sky turned a menacing shade of ochre. A sandstorm, the kind that locals called a haboob, rose from the horizon like a monstrous wave, threatening to swallow everything in its path. There was no outrunning it. Thinking fast, they wrapped the precious satchels in layers of thick cloth. They found a lone acacia tree, its thorny branches a landmark in the otherwise featureless landscape, and buried the books deep beneath its roots, marking the spot in their minds. Then they huddled together, their backs against the trunk, and braced themselves against the wind's fury. The storm raged for hours, a terrifying symphony of howling wind and stinging sand. When it finally cleared, the stars shone with an unnatural clarity in the newly washed sky. But the silence that followed was heavy. The old man's breath had grown shallow and faint. He had spent his last reserves of strength protecting the books and the boy. He looked at Bakari, and a faint, peaceful smile touched his lips. "You have become the library, Bakari," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Carry the words, carry our stories, even when you cannot read them. Let them live inside you." By dawn, Bakari was alone. The silence of the desert was absolute. He survived. He found his way to a distant oasis, and then another. Years passed. The boy grew into a man, his face weathered by the sun, his eyes holding a wisdom far beyond his years. He never forgot his promise. The scholar's words echoed in his heart. Finally, he returned to Timbuktu. The city had changed. Traders still haggled over blocks of salt and bags of gold dust in the bustling markets. But the air felt different. Fewer people spoke of the great libraries. The hunger for knowledge seemed to have been replaced by a hunger for wealth. The city's soul felt quieter. He walked out into the desert, his memory his only map. He found the old acacia tree, its branches now thicker, its roots deeper. He dug into the sand, his hands finding the familiar shape of the leather satchels. He pulled them out. The ink on the pages had faded in places, but the words were still there, waiting. He carried them back to the city, to a library whose walls seemed to whisper his name in welcome. He carefully placed each manuscript back on its shelf, restoring the heart of Timbuktu. Centuries later, when European explorers would arrive, they would be astonished. They would marvel at the thousands upon thousands of books, miraculously preserved against the ravages of time, sand, and conflict. They would write of the city of books, a beacon of learning in the heart of Africa. But none of them would ever know the full story. None would know of the quiet, determined boy who carried a library on his back and became a living vessel for its knowledge. Because, in Timbuktu, the greatest heroes weren't the warriors or the kings. They were the ones who carried knowledge quietly, protecting the flame of wisdom so that future generations could find their way in the dark. They were the keepers of the story. In the golden age of Timbuktu, when the city was a beacon of knowledge shining across the vast Sahara, there lived a calligrapher named Issa al-Fadl. His quill was said to move like a dancer, each stroke perfect, each curve a testament to a life devoted to beauty. He copied sacred texts, complex treatises, and poems that sang of the desert for the city's renowned scholars. His elegant handwriting was more than just ink on parchment. It was a bridge between the heavens and the earth. But time, as it always does, had begun to catch up with him. Age had started to tremble his once steady hands. A cruel irony for a man whose life was defined by precision. Every morning, Issa would sit by the same window, the warm sunlight pooling over his tools, the polished reed pens, the small inkwell filled with a mix of soot and gum, Arabic, and the parchment stretched smooth as a silent, waiting canvas. Outside his window, the city would awaken. The muezzin's call to prayer would rise and fall, a spiritual melody weaving through the air. The laughter of children would echo through the narrow clay streets, a vibrant counterpoint to the quiet reverence of his workroom. Inside, Isa would lose himself in the script, tracing each letter as if he were breathing it into existence. The ink, black and shimmering, would glide from his quill, and for a moment, the world outside would fade away. One afternoon, the rhythm of his day was broken. A young, breathless apprentice burst in, his face pale with fear. He brought terrible news. Soldiers were marching from the north. They were known for their brutality, plundering, burning, and searching for any treasure they could carry away. The library, the very heart of Timbuktu, was their likely target. Issa listened, his expression calm. He simply smiled faintly and said, "Then let us write faster." He took a fresh sheet of parchment and began a new page, which he knew would be his last. He chose a verse from an ancient poet, a line that had given him strength throughout his life. The word survives the sword. As he wrote, his hand shook more than ever. A drop of ink bled into the parchment, a small, dark stain. But he refused to stop. The apprentice watched, mesmerized, as the old master fought against his own body to complete his task. Soon, the distant sound of hooves rattled the door, growing louder with each passing moment. The city's doom was approaching. Isa dipped his pen one final time. Beneath the poet's verse, he wrote a single, final line of his own, and beauty belongs to those who finish their sentence. He then leaned forward and blew gently on the page, his breath a soft prayer, watching the ink dry and set forever. That night, as feared, the library was raided. Torches lit up the darkness as soldiers stormed through the halls, grabbing what they could. But somehow, Isa's last manuscript survived. No one knew how. Legends grew around it. Some whispered that the desert itself, in its ancient wisdom, had folded its sandy arms around that single, precious book, protecting it from the chaos. Over the centuries that followed, walls crumbled and rulers were replaced. But the story of Isa al-Fadl and his last words lived on. Centuries later, the manuscript was rediscovered, hidden away and forgotten. The last line he wrote was faded, barely visible after so long. But under a soft, careful light, the words could still be, "Reader, quiet message sent from a trembling hand across the gulf of time. And beauty belongs to those who finish their sentence." And so it was that in the heart of Timbuktu, the ink remembered its maker. You are under baobab skies. This story is just a small fragment of the incredible history of Timbuktu. To uncover more stories of courage, knowledge, and resilience, you can watch our full 2-hour documentary right here on the channel. Thank you for watching.